When you look at the world, you begin to realize that complexity is often confused with sophistication, and that's a dangerous mistake. We assume that the more complicated something appears, the more valuable it must be. But in reality, the opposite is often true. Simplicity is a form of profound genius because it strips away the unnecessary, the wasteful, the deceitful. Think about language, for instance. When you speak truthfully, your words become clear, direct, and effective. That is why we admire those who tell the truth, even if it's uncomfortable, because their words cut through the fog of confusion. Now, when you embed simplicity into technology, you're creating a tool that aligns with a deeper principle of order. It is not chaos disguised as order. It is genuine order emerging from clarity. UPI is precisely this, a radical embodiment of simplicity applied to something as foundational as money. Money has always been cloaked in mystique, bureaucracy, and unnecessary barriers that have served the interests of the powerful. Banks, credit card companies, international systems, all of them thrive on complexity because complexity hides inefficiency and, more importantly, control. They thrive when the average person feels dependent, confused, or unworthy of engaging directly with financial systems. But then comes UPI, and what does it do? It says, here is money reduced to its essence, and here is how you can use it. Instantly, freely, without being chained to layers of authority. That is not just an economic shift, but a moral one. Because it embodies honesty, the transaction is what it claims to be and nothing else. No hidden layers, no arbitrary delays, no unnecessary fees. It's truth in code. Simplicity, when revealed, is terrifying to those who profit from unnecessary complexity. It is like shining light into a darkened room where shadows once held power. The truth of simplicity does not need explanation. It demonstrates itself. And that's precisely why UPI shakes existing institutions at their core. When people realize that financial transactions can be completed without friction, without unnecessary mediation, they start asking uncomfortable questions. Why were we told it had to be this difficult? Why were we convinced that gatekeepers were essential? The unsettling answer is that many of those barriers were constructed not to serve the people, but to serve the controllers of the system. When you realize that, it's not just a technical revelation, it's a moral awakening. Consider the psychological effect on a person who has always felt excluded from the formal financial system. Perhaps they lived in a village. Perhaps they were told they didn't have the right documentation. Perhaps they didn't trust banks. Suddenly, with nothing more than a mobile phone, they are able to participate in the global economy. That's not just convenience, that's a radical transformation of identity. They are no longer marginalized, no longer dependent on someone else's permission. And once you empower millions of individuals this way, you're not just changing their behavior, you're changing the very structure of society. Because societies are built on how people exchange value, and if you change that, you change everything else too. There's also something spiritually significant about simplicity. When people engage in systems that are straightforward, they experience a kind of alignment between their intentions and their actions. Think about how corrosive it is to deal with bureaucracy forms, delays, confusion, contradictions. It leaves people feeling powerless, even resentful. But when the system is simple, it restores dignity. It says, we trust you to act, we trust you to decide, and we respect your time and energy. That psychological respect embedded in a technological system is far more disruptive than most analysts realize. Because respect is not a trivial thing, it is the very foundation of meaningful cooperation, and UPI, through its radical simplicity, embeds respect at the level of code. Now the United States, and by extension the Western financial order, has built an empire on systems of complexity, layers of credit checks, hidden interest rates, service charges, transaction delays. All these are artifacts of a system designed to extract value from friction. And when you introduce something like UPI, that entire logic is called into question. The system begins to look not like progress, but like obstruction. That is why it feels so threatening, because it reveals that much of the complexity was not necessary, it was contrived. It was the emperor's clothes, and now the world can see that the emperor is, in fact, naked. And when illusions dissolve, power dissolves with them. This is why radical simplicity carries revolutionary force. It is not just a matter of convenience, it is a profound leveling. Once people experience a simpler system that works, they will never want to go back to complexity. This becomes a psychological point of no return. You can't convince someone to willingly embrace chains once they've experienced freedom. That is what makes the disruption irreversible. The truth, once revealed, cannot be hidden again, and those who built their empires on deception and opacity suddenly face a world where their strategies no longer function. That's why UPI is not just an Indian innovation. It's a philosophical challenge to the entire financial architecture of the West. The danger for the old order is that simplicity scales faster than complexity. Complex systems require maintenance, oversight, and authority to keep functioning. Simple systems, by contrast, spread like wildfire because they appeal to common sense and require little explanation. Think of how the internet exploded because its logic was simple. Connect people, allow them to share. UPI is doing the same for money. And once people see that it works at massive scale in one country, they will demand the same elsewhere. That demand is not just technological pressure, it's moral pressure. Because once people know that dignity and fairness are possible, they will no longer tolerate systems that deny them those things. And here's the profound truth. Simplicity, in its radical form, is indistinguishable from justice. Because justice is about fairness, equality of access, and the elimination of arbitrary barriers. A simple system embodies justice precisely because it cannot hide corruption behind convoluted rules. That's why tyrannical systems always thrive on complexity. They hide their oppression behind technicalities. But a simple system exposes everything. It says, this is what it is, take it or leave it. There is no manipulation hidden behind fine print. That, psychologically and morally, is why UPI is so dangerous to the existing powers. It strips away their ability to disguise exploitation as service. When you examine the history of human civilization, you see that finance has always been a tool of hierarchy. Those at the top had access to credit, information, and networks, while those at the bottom were locked out or forced into dependency. That inequality wasn't just material, it was psychological. It reinforced the idea that some people were destined to control and others to obey. But every once in a while, a tool emerges that alters this relationship. UPI is one such tool. It allows a villager in rural India to engage in the same financial transaction system as a global corporation. That's not merely a technical development, it's a shift in the structure of dignity. Dignity arises when barriers collapse, and UPI collapses the barrier between the so-called privileged and the ordinary. Think about what happens when you walk into a bank. You are surrounded by marble floors, counters, paperwork, and a culture of superiority. The institution conveys that you are a supplicant and that your worth is measured by your balance, your credit score, or your history. That environment creates psychological submission. You are reminded of your lesser status. Now imagine bypassing that entire apparatus. With UPI, you need no intermediary, no nod of approval from an institution that treats you with condescension. You simply act, and that action carries within it a radical message. You are enough, you are trusted, you have the same right to transact as anyone else. That is democratization at its core, not through speeches or promises, but through direct access. Access transforms identity, and identity shapes destiny. When someone excluded suddenly becomes included, their perception of self undergoes a transformation. They are no longer a person begging for legitimacy. They are a participant, a player in the system. And when millions undergo this transformation simultaneously, the collective psychology of a nation shifts. That's what is happening with UPI in India. The student paying for a book, the farmer selling produce, the homemaker receiving money from a family member. All are engaging in the same technological space as billion-dollar companies. That commonality builds a sense of shared worth. It is not about money alone. It is about the recognition that your action is equally valid and equally real. And that sense of validation is a seed of empowerment. Democracy has always been incomplete when limited to politics alone. What good is the right to vote if you cannot engage in the economic sphere with equal freedom? Political rights without financial rights become hollow. They give the illusion of participation, but deny the substance. UPI bridges that gap. It says democracy must be extended into the daily economic lives of citizens. It grants the ability to act, trade, save, and send without deference to gatekeepers. That's why it's more than a financial tool, it's an extension of freedom. Freedom is not abstract, it's lived in daily practices. And when the act of sending a single coin carries the same weight as $1 million transfer, then the system has been morally equalized in a way that politics alone could never accomplish. What terrifies existing power structures is that equality at this level undermines their symbolic authority. The banker's suit, the corporation's prestige, the institutional gate's marble facade. These no longer matter when the action of value exchange bypasses them entirely. The poor man and the rich man, the rural and the urban, the educated and the uneducated, all exist on equal footing in the same stream of digital transactions. That leveling is intolerable to systems built on hierarchy, because hierarchy thrives on exclusivity. When exclusivity evaporates, legitimacy erodes. That is why UPI shakes the West. It threatens not their technology but their authority. It whispers a dangerous truth, that dignity belongs to everyone, not just those who can afford to purchase it. Equality of access always produces ripple effects beyond the obvious. Once people taste equality in one domain, they demand it in others. The villager who sends money through UPI begins to question why healthcare, education, or governance should remain mired in inefficiency and exclusion. This is the catalytic effect of democratized systems. They don't just solve one problem, they awaken the expectation of fairness across domains. That is why revolutions rarely remain confined to their starting point. The democratization of finance may very well spill into other sectors, and that possibility terrifies those who profit from scarcity and unfairness. Because once a population knows that barriers can be eliminated, it no longer tolerates barriers elsewhere. Now, consider the symbolic dimension of dignity. Human beings do not live only in material terms, they live in stories, symbols, and meanings. Money is not just a medium of exchange, it is a symbol of recognition. When you can give and receive with ease, you feel seen, acknowledged, and validated. To exclude someone from that process is to declare them invisible. UPI reverses this invisibility. It declares, you exist, you matter, your transaction carries meaning. That symbolic recognition cannot be measured in spreadsheets, but it has profound consequences. It reshapes how people see themselves, how they act in society, and how they teach their children about their worth. It is dignity codified into technology. Western financial systems often underestimate this symbolic dimension because they are obsessed with profit margins and quarterly returns. They forget that human beings crave respect as much as they crave efficiency. That's why UPI is not just efficient, it is respectful. And respect breeds loyalty, trust, and participation at scales no centralized bureaucracy could ever enforce. When you treat people as equals in practice, they become equals in reality. That truth is both liberating and frightening, because it implies that much of the inequality that has persisted was never inevitable. It was constructed. If dignity can be distributed by code, then oppression was sustained by choice, and realizing that forces societies to confront uncomfortable truths about their past and present. Once dignity is distributed, it cannot easily be taken back. You cannot convince a person who has experienced equality to return willingly to inequality. The genie does not go back into the bottle. That permanence is what gives UPI its transformative power. It is not a fleeting innovation. It is a reconfiguration of expectations. The person who can now transact without humiliation will never again tolerate systems that demand it. That resolve creates resilience, and resilience creates momentum. And once momentum builds in millions of lives simultaneously, the trajectory of an entire nation changes. That is what democratization means, not an idea in the abstract, but a lived revolution in daily practice, repeated billions of times over. Institutions are remarkable creations, but they are also deeply fragile. They arise over centuries, layering rule upon rule, bureaucracy upon bureaucracy, until they stand as towering structures of authority. For a time, these institutions appear immovable, permanent, and necessary. But permanence is an illusion because rigidity breeds vulnerability. The more inflexible a system becomes, the less capable it is of adapting to change. Western financial institutions are classic examples of this rigidity. They built their dominance on paperwork, intermediaries, regulations, and layers of verification that seemed unchallengeable. But now, a simple system like UPI reveals that much of this structure was unnecessary all along. And when the mask of necessity falls, fragility is exposed. Consider the way banks present themselves. Austere buildings, vaults of steel, rules written in language ordinary people cannot understand. These symbols project security and legitimacy, convincing us that complexity equals strength. But in reality, that very complexity is the source of weakness. Complexity requires constant maintenance, endless oversight, and vast armies of people who guard its gates. When a simpler alternative emerges, all that effort is revealed as redundant. UPI doesn't need marble floors or endless signatures. It requires a phone and trust coded into algorithms. That contrast is devastating, because once people realize that simplicity can provide the same function, the old institution begins to look like an overgrown relic, clinging to its past relevance. Trust has always been the lifeblood of financial systems. For centuries, people trusted institutions more than individuals because they lacked other options. A bank could fail, a government could default, but the illusion of stability held because no viable alternative existed. But what happens when trust is embedded, not in people or institutions, but in code? That's what UPI demonstrates. It shows that trust can be distributed, automated, and democratized. When transactions settle instantly, without clerks or branches or endless oversight, the entire justification for institutional power crumbles. The fragile core of the system is revealed. It was never about necessity. It was about maintaining control. And control, without necessity, quickly dissolves. The United States, in particular, has thrived by exporting its financial architecture to the world. Its banks, credit card systems, and payment networks became global standards, embedding American influence into daily life across the planet. But systems built on dominance eventually reveal their cracks. They rely on others, continuing to believe that no alternative is possible. UPI shatters that assumption. It demonstrates that a nation can build an independent system at scale that functions without those Western frameworks. This revelation is dangerous, not because the technology is threatening in itself, but because it erodes the aura of inevitability surrounding American institutions. Once inevitability is gone, fragility becomes undeniable and collapse becomes possible. Fragility, however, does not appear all at once. It reveals itself slowly, in cracks and fractures that most people ignore until the whole structure buckles. Western financial systems are already showing those fractures: mounting fees, security breaches, inequitable access, and public discontent. Yet institutions continue to pretend they are invulnerable. They cling to outdated processes because to admit weakness would invite rebellion. But UPI forces the issue. It makes the cracks visible. It says, here is proof that systems can be fairer, faster, simpler. That proof is intolerable to old institutions because it undermines their mythology. And when mythology collapses, loyalty follows, leaving nothing to protect the institution from its own fragility. The story of fragility is always the story of arrogance. Institutions forget that they exist to serve people, not the other way around. They mistake compliance for loyalty and bureaucracy for stability. But compliance maintained through lack of alternatives is a thin foundation. The moment a genuine alternative arises, the arrogance of the institution is revealed. That is what UPI is doing to the Western financial order. It exposes the arrogance of assuming that people had no other choice. And once arrogance is exposed, people feel betrayed. Betrayal breeds resentment, and resentment is a force that can shatter even the most imposing systems. It is resentment, not external competition, that often brings empires down. Think of how people psychologically respond when they discover they were misled. At first, there is disbelief, then anger, then a determination to escape the old order. When people realize that banking could have been simple all along, they will never view the old systems with the same reverence again. Reverence is fragile. It requires constant reinforcement through symbols and rituals. But once undermined, reverence collapses permanently. UPI does not just compete with Western systems. It delegitimizes them by comparison. Every time a person sends money instantly without fees, they see Western delays and charges as exploitative rather than necessary. That shift in perception is fatal to institutional credibility, because credibility, once lost, cannot be reconstructed easily. The irony is that institutions often destroy themselves by refusing to adapt. They cling to their old forms out of fear, yet it is that very clinging that accelerates their decline. The West could learn from UPI, could adopt its principles, could transform itself in response. But pride resists humility. Pride says, our way is the only way. Our system is the global standard. Our dominance is eternal. History, however, shows that no dominance is eternal. Every empire believed it was permanent until the moment it wasn't. The fragility of Western financial systems lies not only in their outdated methods, but in their refusal to admit they could learn from others. That refusal is the seed of downfall. What makes this moment so profound is that fragility is being revealed in real time. For decades, financial dominance was unquestioned. Alternatives were dismissed as impractical, unscalable, or unsophisticated. Yet here we are, with hundreds of millions of people transacting daily through a system that bypasses the old order entirely. Fragility is no longer hypothetical, it is exposed in the data, in the experience, in the lived reality of ordinary people. Once fragility is exposed, momentum builds toward change. People begin to lose patience with inefficiency, question authority, and demand reform. And once reform is demanded at scale, institutions either transform or collapse. UPI is not merely an alternative system, it is the mirror that reveals the old system's weakness. Responsibility is the foundation of meaning. People crave freedom, but they often forget that freedom without responsibility collapses into chaos. True power lies not in the ability to act arbitrarily, but in the ability to act with direction, purpose, and accountability. UPI is not merely a technological convenience, it is an embodiment of responsibility at multiple levels. It represents the responsibility of a nation to serve its citizens, the responsibility of individuals to engage honestly, and the responsibility of the global order to face innovation rather than deny it. Systems like UPI remind us that progress does not emerge from excuses. It emerges from action rooted in responsibility. And that is precisely what unsettles the old order. Because responsibility always carries a moral weight that disrupts complacency. When India built UPI, it was not just building software. It was taking responsibility for its people. It was saying, we will not wait for foreign systems to trickle down. We will create our own. That decision was not trivial. It was the conscious assumption of national responsibility. It meant shouldering the burden of risk, of innovation, of potential failure. But meaning comes from shouldering burdens. By lifting that weight, India demonstrated that responsibility is not something to be avoided, but embraced. The West often speaks of innovation, but hesitates to carry its burdens fully, preferring profit over people. UPI exposes that hesitancy. It proves that when responsibility is placed at the center, the outcomes are both moral and transformative. And that lesson is deeply unsettling to nations that have forgotten this principle. At the individual level, responsibility transforms how people interact with money. In old systems, complexity allowed people to evade responsibility. Delays, hidden fees, and opaque processes created excuses, always allowing someone to blame the system rather than themselves. But UPI demands clarity. When you send money, it is instant, transparent, undeniable. That immediacy forces individuals to act with precision and accountability. There are no hidden processes to obscure intention. That changes psychology. It reminds people that their choices matter directly, without delay or disguise. Responsibility is reintroduced into daily life, not as a punishment, but as empowerment. Because when your actions bear immediate fruit, you are reminded of your agency. And agency is the seed of genuine freedom. Responsibility also appears in the willingness to innovate for the collective good rather than for narrow gain. Many Western financial systems are built around extracting profit at every stage. Each fee, each interest charge, each delay serves the institution, not the individual. But UPI was designed with a different ethic. It was not built to maximize profit, but to maximize access. That ethic is responsibility in practice. It is the recognition that technology must serve the many, not just the few. And that ethic shakes the global order because it reveals an uncomfortable truth, that institutions elsewhere could have done the same but chose not to. They shirked responsibility for people in pursuit of profit, and now they must confront the moral cost of that choice. Responsibility also means adaptation. Systems that refuse to adapt are systems that decay. The West, by clinging to its archaic financial structures, is abdicating responsibility to the future. It is pretending that yesterday's methods can sustain tomorrow's demands. But responsibility requires acknowledging reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. UPI acknowledges the reality of a digital world, the ubiquity of mobile technology, and the necessity of inclusivity. It does not cling to nostalgia. It builds for the present and the future. That adaptability is responsibility manifest, because only those willing to adapt can claim they are truly serving those who depend on them. And failure to adapt is not just incompetence. It is a moral failure. a refusal to bear the responsibility of progress. There is also responsibility in scale. To build a system that can handle billions of transactions daily requires not only technical brilliance, but moral seriousness. It demands the recognition that millions will depend on this infrastructure, and that failure would devastate lives. Carrying that weight requires humility and foresight. It requires asking, how do we ensure this serves everyone, not just the elite? That is responsibility at its most profound, because it does not seek applause but prepares quietly for stability and fairness. The fact that UPI can scale responsibly demonstrates that innovation and morality are not separate. They are interwoven. And that interweaving terrifies old powers, because it reveals that responsibility, when embraced, produces strength beyond their imagination. Responsibility also shatters excuses at the international level. For decades, poorer nations were told they could not innovate, that they must depend on Western institutions for financial legitimacy. But UPI destroys that narrative. It proves that responsibility is not confined to wealth. It is a choice. A nation can choose to take responsibility for its own destiny rather than outsource it. That choice exposes the irresponsibility of others. It reveals that dependency was often encouraged not by necessity, but by manipulation. And when responsibility is claimed by one nation, it calls others to account. Why have you not done the same? Why do you cling to outdated systems? That questioning is precisely what makes UPI so threatening. It forces the world to confront its own abdication of responsibility. Psychologically, responsibility is the antidote to despair. People who feel powerless, excluded, or marginalized often sink into hopelessness. But when responsibility is returned to them, when they can act directly, when their choices matter, they begin to transform. Hopelessness turns into determination. Exclusion turns into participation. Responsibility is what gives people the sense that life has meaning because their actions produce real consequences. UPI restores that at scale. By granting financial responsibility to millions, it grants meaning. And meaning is far more powerful than profit. Meaning strengthens societies, stabilizes communities, and inspires individuals. That is why responsibility embedded in technology is revolutionary. It creates meaning where there was once only frustration and dependence. And finally, responsibility is always a challenge to complacency. Complacency thrives in systems where excuses are plentiful and consequences are distant. But responsibility collapses excuses and brings consequences to the forefront. It demands action. It demands engagement. That is why UPI unsettles not just the West, but anyone clinging to outdated power structures. Because responsibility reveals who is willing to serve and who is hiding behind complexity. It draws a sharp line between those who rise to the challenge and those who retreat into excuses. And that is the deepest reason why systems built on irresponsibility fear it so intensely. Because once responsibility is embraced, their complacency is revealed for what it truly is: weakness disguised as strength.